So this is the second part of the video about the Islamic Republic of Iran for higher level history students. The early years of the Islamic Republic are dominated by the foreign policy crisis that is the Iran-Iraq War. In September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, hoping to take advantage of the sort of instability in Iran and blaming kind of Iranian interference in Iraqi politics. Khomeini's revolutionary rhetoric is kind of pretty scary to Saddam Hussein, of course, who is managing a huge Shia majority, even though the ruling authorities of Iraq are Sunni Muslims. Saddam also has his own personal ambitions to sort of settle ideological and religious differences. Iraq expected a quick victory and quickly occupies most of Arabic-speaking south of Iran. But the Iranian recovery takes a couple of years, probably by 1982, 1983, and that's when Iraq really does begin to struggle a little bit. Most Iranians do support their government in the war, and it's a moment that really brings the Iranian people together. There's Kurdish uprisings in the north of Iraq supported by Iran, and by the 1984 there is a stalemate. Khomeini rejects the mediations. He argues that the Iraqi people, the majority of whom are Shia, should establish their own Islamic Republic in Baghdad. He also feels that the war was started by Iraq and they should be more punished for doing so. Iraq starts an economic warfare. We usually talk about the tanker war, blocking the Persian Gulf to slow down but it's actually Iran that blocks the Persian Gulf to slow down Iraqi oil exports. The War of the Cities, both Tehran and Baghdad are attacked using Scud missiles. Iraq uses chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers as well as its own citizens. And Iraq does have the superior air power. Iran is sort of struggling with Shah-era technologies, and that will hold them back. International support for Iraq, it grows throughout the war and is fairly consistent. The USA is involved with a number of incidents with its ships in the Gulf region. But by July the 20th, 1988, there is United Nations Security Resolution 598 from the UN Security Council doesn't solve the problems, but brings the fighting to an end. Both sides are challenged immensely during this awfully long war, and it is an awful war. And you can see here some of the advantages and disadvantages that both sides have. So this, if you want to take some notes here, press pause now. In terms of the end of the war, like I said earlier, it will be a unifying moment for Iran, and it really will, for many people, cement their support for the Iranian government for what it's worth. But after 8 years, the price paid is very high. Khomeini tries to use the war politically, Iran versus the world, and that's perhaps still a central trope of Iranian foreign policy to this day. Both sides will take the opportunity to remove eternal opposition. A few Iranian Kurds and Sunnis joined the Iraqi side, but actually, according to Luciano Zakara of Qatar University, very few Iraqi Shia fought with Iran. So in actual fact, the kind of lines divided pretty nationally. Other countries are trying to stop the war. Saudi Arabia offers money. The GCC countries, in particular Bahrain, and also Saudi Arabia, are worried about their Shia minorities rising up and their threats to their own power. Khomeini have been supporting liberation movements and Shia uprisings, and also threatening the monarchies of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So there's quite a lot going on here. The war ends in a stalemate in 1988, and neither side really has gained any significant territorial, political or economic advantage. But the costs and the conflict for both sides, of course, was absolutely devastating. So whatever else is happening in the Iran at this time period is dominated by the war. So as you think about preparing for review, think about the types of essay questions that could be being asked about you. You might want to have a look at change and continuity between the Shah and the Islamic Revolution, and you might want to have a look to see if the lives of ordinary people are getting better or worse. So political control, how the Islamic Republic runs itself, what happens to the economy of Iran during this time, what's happening to society and religious ordinances, there will be something that you might want to look at, and foreign policy. So maybe if you want to use this opportunity for a review, perhaps you could press pause now and anticipate some of the questions that you could get asked and what you might say to answer them. So the Islamic Republic is new in the world. It's the first time that anything like this has ever been tried in the modern era, and Islamic criteria used to establish legislation. You can have a look elsewhere for the constitution of the Islamic Republic, and there's lots of sort of charts and infographics that will take you through it. It's pretty complex. It looks like on paper there's an effective distribution of power, but in reality, the theological leader, the supreme leader, is the one that probably has most of the power and control. It is a participatory democracy, and Iranians do have the right to vote. Khomeini is named as an individual in the 1979 constitution, and he does, in his later years, try to make plans for his succession. He's actually trying to kind of prevent a power squabble, and it might suggest perhaps he doesn't really trust his inner circle. So this is going to be a key issue for Iran in the future. It's actually kind of after Khomeini's death in 1989, is kind of moving on from his legacy. In terms of how things go down, as I said earlier, the war dominates everything and then perhaps provides the new government with an opportunity to really tighten control fairly quickly. Any kind of improvements in the economy are obviously going to be threatened by the war itself, and of course social developments are also having a massive impact as thousands of men are being called up to fight. A new secret police is created, so there's definitely a continuity there. And the Revolutionary Guard, this group of sort of political people end up becoming a state within a state. So they will become more powerful. They'll start running businesses. They'll start making their own money. Those types of things are going on. The censorship mechanisms of the Shah estate also are maintained and used again by the new governments. There's lots of things going on there, and you can also see perhaps some continuity with the Shah's regime. In terms of the economy, Iran really will begin to struggle. Iran would like to produce more oil to try and pay for the war, but other OPEC members, needless to say, are siding with Iraq at this time, and they disagree. Iran will suffer between 1979 and into the early 80s as middle class and upper class Iranians leave the revolution, as minority groups, in particular Baha'i people, also will leave because of the revolution. Iran is kind of deprived of that group of educated professionals. The war is incredibly expensive, and during the 1980s, remember, Iran's biggest export earner, 90% of Iran's earnings are coming from oil, so any impact from oil prices will cause the Iranian economy to struggle. In terms of how life changes for ordinary people, by 1982, criminal law has been completely revised. Women had been active participants in the revolution, and now religious traditions were really encouraging. Perhaps some of the other things for women were not so promising. The legal age of marriage is reduced to 13. The family protection law, which enabled women to, which had improved women's divorce rights, is annulled. By the late 1980s, actually after the death of Khomeini, President Rafsanjani does call for equal pay for women workers, but still that idea that in public life men and women should be separated wherever possible. In terms of education, Iran is still struggling with the challenges it faced under the Shah. There's too many young people, not enough teachers, but education is being encouraged. But getting children into quality schools and having quality resources to help them learn is definitely more of a challenge. In terms of foreign policy, and we looked at this question before, Iran struggles to export the revolution. They call on other countries to overthrow their leaders. Of course, Anwar Sadat in Egypt is assassinated in 1981. In Saudi Arabia, again, a country that also has a significant Shia minority. But others in the region also begin to push back. The Sunni-Shia divide is just too great for Iran to overcome. In the late 1980s, they really have no alignment at all. And I'm sure you're aware of the US occupation, the US embassy occupation in 1979. That will cause tremendous problems for Iran, really actually, I suppose, until this day. There's definitely some other things going on behind the scenes. In the mid-1980s with the Iran-Contra affair, America is hoping that Iran would actually mediate with Hezbollah over the hostage crisis in Lebanon. And it actually does shows you again the pragmatism of Iran. They would do business with the USA. They're desperate for American weapons during the Iran-Iraq war. So when the Iran-Contra affair is exposed, of course, Iran will go to the Soviet Union for weapons instead. So the foreign policy is really pragmatic and on a needs base, but really, in general, overall, the Iranians are struggling to make positive relationships at this time. I suspect any question that you answer will follow the immediate 10 years, but I mean, the IB takes you to 2000, so it's worth being familiar with what happens afterwards. In 1989, President Khamenei takes on the role of the spiritual leader, and Rafsanjani is elected the president. The key thing, as I mentioned earlier, is just really be aware it's very difficult to kind of get over the legacy of Ayatollah Khamenei in the next few years. Economic problems, as you can see there, continue to challenge what's going on, and of course the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait is a huge deal. Saddam actually promises in 1989, also sort of suggests in 1990, that here's an opportunity to sort of settle issues with Iran and fight against a common enemy, the Gulf monarchies in America. Iran opposes Iraq's invasion and also opposes the UN and American response, but they do comply with all the UN Security Council resolutions regarding the Gulf War. And on an international level, here's an opportunity for Iran to kind of rehabilitate itself in the United Nations. So the Gulf War, although it does actually provide an opportunity for Iran to kind of, be presented as a sort of a reasonable dealer in this region. Iran will help Iraqis Shia who also rise up against Saddam Hussein. By 1991, they're talking to Saudi Arabia again, and also continuing their work to support Shia groups across the region. Socially, things are moving on a little bit. More magazines are being published. Women still need permission to work outside the home, but things are relaxing a little bit. In 1987, Mohammad Khatami is elected the president. He's especially popular with kind of the young women, urban types. His reformist, relaxing policies are well liked. He's actually re-elected again in 2001. So just as our time period for IB history is ending, there does seem to be a relaxation, although just be aware in 2001 he kind of gets derailed by hardline in the ulama. And so things are going on. That probably the last thing that you want to sort of think about is in 1999, some pretty big student protests in Tehran. Students are protesting about closing a newspaper, and dorms were raided, leading to one death and many injuries. The student protests spread, and perhaps some of the students, given Khatami's kind of artsy, international groovy reputation, may have hoped that Khatami would side with them. He doesn't. The police suppresses it, and Khatami does not support the students. So Iran is, having a mixed review in the 1990s, but all in all, the state is in charge of what's going on, and they're perhaps warming up on an international level. So go back to that original proposal that you were looking at earlier and begin to think now, how does this piece of the puzzle fit in with what you would want to say about the Islamic Republic of Iran? It's worthwhile making a few different kind of essay plans for this question, thinking about what the Islamic Revolution is trying to achieve, whether or not it's been successful, how well the government does. Domestic foreign is also a good one for this time period, and the conditions by which the revolution in 1979 happens and the methods by which it's carried it out. So hopefully that's helped you with your studies. Thanks for listening.